In this lecture, we'll be examining a tragic episode, the Armenian Massacres of 1915, that in the enormity of these events stands out even against the vast tragic backdrop of the war as a whole. We'll examine in this context how scapegoating of one particular group would tip into genocide as a phenomenon. The First World War formed the context for the launching of what is considered the first full-scale modern genocide, the 1915 Armenian Massacres in Ottoman Turkey, one of the Central Powers allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. It's estimated that between 500,000 and 1 million men, women, and children of the Armenian minority in the Ottoman Empire were killed or died from abuse in the government's resettlement campaign and massacres. The Christian Armenians were considered a suspect population and a liability on the home front by the leadership of the Ottoman Empire. At a time of worldwide suffering, generally in the context of war, international reactions to these murders, when news emerged of these events, were muted. This important example shows how the war itself, as a total war, seemingly normalized mass violence. And the targeting of civilians would be an ongoing reality of the very phenomenon of total war. Beyond this as well, the Armenian massacres would form a precedent for later genocides of the 20th century. We want first to examine the origins and background of this phenomenon as a whole. The intensity of total war, historians argue, helps make genocidal conditions possible. Genocide simply means the mass killing of an entire group of people because of their identity, of the killing of a group of people or a part of that people, according to the formal judicial definition of genocide. War, as it makes mass violence seemingly normal, in some sense lowers inhibitions against this sort of particular form of mass murder. In World War I, what's often considered the first modern genocide took place in Ottoman Turkey. Clearly there had been massacres before in the past, but this form of mass murder, united to the technological energies of the war, was something new. Between 500,000 and 1 million Armenians were annihilated. An earlier history had preceded these horrific events. The Armenians were a Christian community within the Ottoman Empire with a long and proud history in the region. Indeed, it's very much a brutal irony that in earlier ages, the Armenians had been considered very nearly a model group or an exemplary minority among the many different ethnic groups of the Ottoman Empire by their rulers. This, however, would change over time as nationalist ideas grew. The Armenians lived mostly in the eastern portions of the Ottoman Empire, in Anatolia and south of the Caucasus Mountains, essentially near the border with Russia and with Iran. What was very important in this context was that other Armenian communities along the border with Russia spilled across the border. So in some sense, this was a community that had on both sides of these imperial borders related ethnic groups which gave them sort of a transnational identity. But the Armenian communities weren't only limited to these particular geographic locations in concentration, they were also, as a minority, spread throughout the empire as a whole. They were spread throughout the empire's cities and towns and the ports on the Mediterranean as what's commonly called a commercial diaspora, as a people who excelled at trading and in commercial ties. They very clearly had fulfilled a tremendously important economic and commercial role in the Ottoman Empire, a role that eventually would nonetheless lead to friction that would produce the scapegoating of this group. In the late 19th century, their status as a model minority had started to change. And in particular, outside forces played a role here. In the late 19th century, Europeans started to speak of an Armenian question, And the Armenian question was part of a larger Eastern question. That's to say, what will become of an apparently declining Ottoman Empire? The Armenian question, however, took on a specific significance. It was a way of asking, what of the Christian minorities of the Ottoman Empire? If they face discrimination, who might speak up for them? Well, on the one hand, this anxiety over an Armenian question was motivated by a real concern for a religious minority that was related to that of other European Christians, but it could also, on the other hand, function as a pretext or a premise legitimizing the involvement of European great powers in Ottoman affairs as, in their own self-image, protectors of vulnerable Christian communities, as those who were defending the rights that had been accorded to these minority groups and thus fulfilling an important and very legitimate international legal role. Now, obviously, such claims of humanitarian intervention would at times be grounded and at other times would be seen by the Ottomans instead as outside interference that would be resented. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire's traditional structures, a growing nationalism grew up in reaction. In particular, the ruling classes of the Ottoman Empire came to identify with Turkish identity. What earlier had been a multinational, multi-ethnic empire was now to be reconfigured as being somehow, at the same time, Turkish in identity. And the result was that Armenians, as a group that were quite distinct ethnically, fell victim to both stereotyping, discrimination, as well as violence as this nationalism grew. Both on occasion the commercial prosperity that they had won while fulfilling an important economic role, as well as their status as religious outsiders or religious minority, and their status as a protected group in whose favor the great powers could threaten to intervene, made them very conspicuous as a minority. They fell victim to massacres in the 1890s, so already well before the First World War, with the estimated toll somewhere on the number of 200,000 casualties. These massacres of the 1890s were notorious. They led to even more furious demands by the European great powers that the status of the Armenians be respected, and in turn increased resentment against this group as well. At the same time, a very important change was taking place in the internal politics of what was often seen as a moribund Ottoman Empire. A young group of determined activists had emerged with a determination to modernize, to reform, and reestablish the Ottoman Empire on an entirely new basis. This group of young reformers or modernizers, self-conscious modernizers, were called by the name the Young Turks. And indeed, this is a phrase or a term, an appellation that continues to our own times. We talk about someone who's ambitious or who's a go-getter as a Young Turk, and that indeed hails from the reputation for dynamism and for ambition that these Young Turks had evidenced at the start of the 20th century. The Young Turks were an elite leadership group that grew out of a secret society called the Committee for Union and Progress that had been founded in 1900. The Committee for Union and Progress, as its very name suggested, pursued plans to revitalize the empire, to reform it, to make it more efficient, and in other words, to give it a lease on life for later in the 20th century. The Young Turks infiltrated, secretly at first, important positions of power. They came to exercise important influence in the officer corps as well as in the bureaucracy. And they came to power within the empire as a whole in 1908. Important changes, however, were taking place in the ideology of the Young Turks. Initially, their ideology had focused on somewhat vague ideals that were called Ottomanism. This ideology suggested that it was necessary to cultivate and craft and celebrate an overarching Ottoman identity, which privileged loyalty to the state and to the Ottoman dynasty over the whatever ethnic differences of language or of background might also obtain. So in some sense, their hope was that the establishment of a strong state and centralized state traditions would produce, out of their very vitality, an identity called Ottomanism.